Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the latest installment in the Grip live stream that we really need to figure out a better name for than simply Grip live stream with Jason Osborne. One thing at a time, though. Um, yeah, thank you all very much for tuning in last week. It was the most feedback I've ever gotten about doing anything, funny enough. So, off to a good start, and hopefully, we'll continue that this week. No, well, I was going to say no less contentious a topic this week, but probably more contentious because last week we spoke about birth rates and Pascal Donohue's comments to the effect that the government doesn't really have any role to play in impacting in developing policies for affecting birth rates because to their mind the policies tried elsewhere haven't really done anything. So we're going to speak about something slightly tangential this week, but I think that does weigh in on this topic somewhat, which is essentially the breakdown in relations between the sexes. And the reason this is on my mind is because I think this gets to the heart of a lot of the conversation that's taking place in America at the moment that I think is really interesting. And I think it's going to become more prominent in Ireland in the coming years, probably. What I mean is, in relation to whether or not society is kind of failing men at the moment, whether or not society is sort of geared towards women currently. There are ways, obviously, that this weighs in on the birth rate, as I mentioned, and it was kind of in thinking about the connection between those two things that I thought it'd be worth discussing. So, as always, I should add, feel free to comment. We're going to try and make this as interactive as we can. That would be one of the unique selling points, I suppose, being able to do a live stream. So feel free to comment wherever you are. Give me your thoughts on this, and no guarantee that I'll be able to read everything out because this being the internet, you know how it is. But whatever is reasonable and usable there, we'll put up on the screen and try to engage with it a little bit. But yeah, without further ado, and I'm going to try and look at the camera more this week because I was slated by a couple of people last week for looking at my laptop screen too much. What we're going to try and do is set the stage first because I obviously look at these things, read articles, write articles for a living, so I might be a little more tuned in to what's going on here. But I don't think you really need to have to be that clued into what's going on the internet to have observed this phenomena. This idea that sort of the distance between men and women has grown somewhat. I think that you see it in all sorts of ways. I think one really good example is toxic masculinity is all we ever hear about masculinity. I'm 29, not that long ago, since I was in college, since I was in school. I was very aware, as were all of my friends, that pretty much all that was ever said about our demographic was bad, that there was sort of very little that we could contribute, and in fact a lot that we had to atone for things that we hadn't done, but by virtue of other people of our demographic that we had to atone for those things. Toxic masculinity is all we ever hear about. I mean, you tune into RTE, into Virgin Media, their talk shows frequently hear about this. It'll come as no surprise to anyone. There's all sorts of trends that we just take as normal now that we really shouldn't. One thing that came to mind as I was preparing for this is the fact that violence is often recast now as male violence, which that's so obviously wrong to me. It's crazy that it ever took off, but it did. People do it, and they feel like they're righteous and justified in doing so, which is obviously a phrase that implicates all men, despite the fact that not all men are violent. Uh, this kind of reached a bit of a peak. I don't know if people remember back in 2021, there was that horrific murder of Sarah Everard at the hands of that police officer over in the UK. And you had things like Baroness Jenny Jones at the time calling for a curfew for men after 6 p.m. This was, as I say, back in 2021, like calling for a curfew for men after 6 p.m. You know, talk about dehumanization on the off the back of a bad thing that one man did. So I do feel like, I mean, there's a number of other things we could turn to here. A number of cases where people were, ready to turn on Irish men, only for it to turn out that there was nothing to the story. I'm thinking here, it's amazing how this incident was memory hold. I don't know if people remember that Carlo school incident that the media was so quick to jump on here, where it was reported. I can't remember for the life of me where it was pulled out of. Apparently nowhere, that a school had to tell its female students to essentially stop wearing the particular clothing they were wearing because it was distracting the male teachers. It was entirely fabricated, entirely made up, but that didn't stop all of the commentary, uh, the hordes on social media berating men and telling them that they had to do better and that people had to have conversations with their uh, male relatives and friends and things like this. Was the Irish version of the mate campaign that they have in London. I'm not sure what that would be, lad or something like this. But yeah, how quick people were to jump on Irish men and assume the sort of worst about them, assume that, yeah, gosh, those bastards must be, leering at all of the women in school. And then, yeah, the story was completely made up. So just there is a tendency, I suppose, to jump on what's on men to assume that they're inclined to do the worst or to set out from the worst possible place. And obviously, I think that's problematic to use the modern lingo. Um, on the flip side, then I can't how often on social media I come across a post to the effect that modern women are trash based on the sort of misdoings of or the perceived misdoings of one woman or something like this. I think that there is a mutual antagonism developing between men and women that, as we'll get into, I don't think is particularly healthy or good for anyone. Certainly not good for the birth rates that we were discussing last week. But nevertheless, just trying to set the stage here, I think there are a lot of unhealthy dynamics at play. I think that young men are feeling besieged, and as I said, I've experienced this. I understand why they feel that way, and I think we'll get a little bit into why that is sort of playing out the way it is. I mean, we're going to touch on the sort of Nick Fuentes phenomenon over in the US because that certainly didn't come out of nowhere. And for all of you know, I do think he's deplorable personally, but I also understand where he came from and I understand why. Oh, we've got comments coming in here too. Um, Keen not to ignore people. Did I see Robinson? I presume that is on his visit to Poland. No, I didn't see Tommy Robinson on his visit to Poland. It's a big country. I didn't bump into him on my way to the shop. Um, do I see the divergence in political views? And I'll put this comment up on screen. Actually, the tech guy was telling me there's something we can do. Patrick Russell, do you see the divergence in political views in the US between men and women being replicated here? Hearing that women are moving a lot more towards the left there. This is the difficulty with doing a live stream. I could do with about 5 minutes to figure out my answer to that. I do, generally speaking, I do think that's taking place. I was actually going to bring up shortly that, yeah, there's clear data that indicates that the thing isn't so much that men have become more conservative as women have become far more liberal over in the US anyway, going by US data. But I would be pretty confident in assuming that to be the case in Ireland as well. I think a lot of people tuning in would probably be of the opinion that that's in accord with their lived experience, to use the critical theorist term. Um, so I do think women are moving towards the left, and I don't necessarily think men are becoming more conservative, although some obviously are. But yeah, we'll get into that a little bit. So thank you for that comment, Patrick. Um, but on with the thing. So yeah, where I wanted to go with this first is the fact that this, yeah, say, as I said, I will be referring to some American data, but it's also not just America. As I say, I think there are indications this is happening in Ireland. South Korea is a prime example of this. Like relationships between the sexes are absolutely toxic in South Korea. I think it's the former president now, Yoon Suk Yeol, who was elected back in 2022. Probably butchered his name there, but anyway, in large part thanks to his explicitly anti-feminist stance. That was a large reason for his initial popularity. As you might expect, with that being a popular position in that country, young men are growing ever more opposed to feminism. A 2019 survey by a news outlet there found that 60% of men in their 20s showed a considerable to extreme aversion to feminism and its perceived effects on society, while young women continue to move in a liberal direction. I didn't write this down beforehand, so I'm going to go off memory here. But if I remember correctly, and Fatima could, if she were here with us, could give us a bit more information on this because she is very knowledgeable about South Korean society. There's I think it's called the 4B movement in South Korea, where women are essentially dropping out of a lot of the traditional things that women have done, not just in South Korea but elsewhere, as a result of the perceived failings of men. So, South Korea also has the lowest birth rate in the world, if I'm remembering correctly. It's something like 0.7. So the antagonism between the sexes definitely has a role to play in that. I mean, it's a broader phenomena than just being correlated to the falling birth rate, say. But it definitely has a role to play in that. But and while South Korea is a particularly extreme example, it isn't alone in that. Just to get to that American data I kept mentioning, a Gallup poll last year, so pretty reliable stuff. Um, in the US, obviously found that women aged between 18 to 30 are now 30 percentage points more likely to be liberal than men of the same age, which, if I'm remembering correctly, is a gap wider than at any previous point in the history of the US, at least as long as they've been doing polling. That's pretty considerable, I would say. Uh, you do see the divide playing out sort of in the voting patterns of the way the men and women in the US. Young women are far, far more likely to vote Democrat. I don't have the stats in front of me again. I can't have every stat in the world in front of me that I'd like to touch on, but it was something like 70, 80% of women voted Zoran Mamdani in the recent New York mayoral election. So, which obviously drew a lot of commentary because people thought it was kind of like, turkeys voting for Thanksgiving, to use the American phrasing. We shall see about that. But anyway, men are obviously more less inclined to vote Democrat. They vote more so Republican, although there's a lot of disengagement. And I do think that while women are rapidly becoming more liberal in the US, as I've mentioned a couple of times, that does not necessarily mean that men are becoming more conservative. There are actually indications that men are becoming more moderate, which is to say that they're just describing various issues. They're less likely to describe issues as priorities than their female counterparts. And they're also some information indicates that they're less likely to engage in civic and social life than they used to. Um, I think that's really interesting. I think that this sort of male disengagement is something that really requires some study and some consideration because we've got more comments coming in. I need to keep looking at the thing. Gavin Boyne, an old friend of mine. Hope all is well, Jason. All is very well, Gavin. Hope all is well with you. Mary Rose, look at the support for Kamala from liberal women. Well, yeah, exactly. That's just to the point that I was making there. So I do think that the sort of phenomenon of men becoming less engaged, more likely to drop out or not care is really interesting. And it's in relation to that I kind of want to bring up the first article that I wanted to consider this evening. And I found it really interesting because this made huge waves in the US and I didn't really hear it discussed at all in Ireland. Now, I think that's obvious as insofar as the mainstream media is concerned, because as you'll see shortly, it's a pretty as far as our national political atmosphere is. This would be an unpopular theory, but I didn't even see much commentary about it on social media, so I think it just sort of slipped the net. This is the great feminization theory by Helen Andrews. I do think that there are problems with this theory, but I think it's very interesting nonetheless. And as I say, because there was no discussion about it, why not have a look at some of it this evening? Last week I shared my screen a good bit. I'm not going to do that this week because that was also another bit of feedback I got from my good wife as well, who said, yeah, no one wants to look at you staring at a screen for 30, 45 minutes. I'd much rather see you looking at the camera. So going to submit to her wisdom there. Not sure what that says about my masculinity, but anyway, I'm going to read out a couple of sort of select quotes that give us an idea of sort of the case that she's making here. And we'll get right to the heart of it. She wrote at one point, she spoke about a cancellation that took place in the US back in the early 2000s. It was at Harvard, if I'm remembering correctly, in which someone was speaking about the sciences and about how generally speaking, men are drawn more to the sciences. Generally speaking, have more of an aptitude for the sciences. This was extremely unpopular with some of the women in the audience who, despite the talk that he was giving being off the record, they sent some of the comments by this person to a reporter, and then it blew up. Long story short, the guy lost his job. Now, Helen Andrews in her article says this cancellation was feminine. Uh, this is well, she doesn't argue that. She was quoting an essay here, and the essay was saying that this cancellation was feminine because all cancellations are feminine. Cancel culture is simply what women do when there are enough of them in a given organization or field. That is the great feminization thesis, which the same author later elaborated upon at book length. Everything you think of as wokeness is simply an epiphenomenon of demographic feminization. And that's kind of what Helen Andrews zoomed in on. She was primarily interested in wokeness and I'm going to assume here everyone knows what I'm talking about when I say wokeness, because it kind of drives me a little crazy when you encounter these. I was describe them as men of nuance on social media who say, "Oh, could you define wokeness? Could you tell me what that is?" And it's like, you know what it is. Um, it's simply Helen Andrews was essentially saying that wokeness is simply feminine patterns of behavior applied to institutions where women were few in number until recently. Um, I think that's obviously an interesting theory. As I say, it's no wonder that this wasn't picked up on by Irish media or wasn't discussed more so by Irish media. It's picked up on like it's some sort of, discovery. It's not a discovery, it's a theory that someone was forwarding. But it's an interesting one, and it's not one that you hear voiced very often. Hence there being some value in bringing it up. So, she was saying that it's uh, more important than when women sort of first entered fields like the legal field, journalism, and things like that, is when women became majority in those fields. That's kind of what's dictated the transformation of workplaces and societies and things like this. And I'm just going to keep an eye here on the chat as well. I'm going to get smoother at this as time goes on, because people forgive me. I'm new enough to live streaming, so swapping between tabs, I don't have it like an old hand yet. But anyway, yeah, so she says it's more important, not so much when women first entered fields, because that happened a long time ago at this stage, certainly decades ago in many instances, as when women became majority in those fields. That's when the sort of institutional atmosphere, the institutional culture began to change and affect some of the changes that she's going to sort of outline. Um, she says that everything you think of as wokeness involves prioritizing the feminine over the masculine, empathy over rationality, safety over risk, cohesion over competition. Uh, she says that, and I'm just going to keep quoting here because it's interesting. Men tend to be better at compartmentalizing than women. Wokeness was in many ways a society wide failure to compartmentalize. Traditionally, an individual doctor might have opinions on the political issues of the day, but he would regard it as his professional duty to keep those opinions out of the examination room. Now that medicine has become more feminized, doctors wear pins and lanyards expressing views on controversial issues from gay rights to Gaza. Um, I'm obviously curious to hear what our viewers make of this. I don't just want to use this as a platform to share my thoughts. And indeed, this isn't necessary. As I say, I think there's some flaws with this theory, which we'll probably get into towards the end. I'm sort of just trying to open this up for debate because I didn't see this debate taking place in Ireland, and I think it's a really interesting one. So I'm very open to hearing what you all have to say about it. I see Niall here saying wokeness is any attempt to use weaponized or misplaced empathy as a shibboleth for the purpose of control. I think that yeah, I'm not sure whether Helen Andrews would you should probably would agree with that. Put it up again. Yeah, misplaced empathy. I mean, I know this obviously kind of ties into Sad's uh, theory of suicidal empathy being the downfall of the West. So we have wokeness as breaking people into sections and having the Olympic grief games, also known as intersectionalism, from Frank. I mean, yeah, certainly. that's been the whole thing. It sort of didn't deal with people as individuals. It rather sort of dealt with people as members of particular demographics, and then yeah, sort of either advantage them or disadvantage them according to that, which obviously is, as we get into, where the grievance young white men in particular have. Um, from Mary here. Liberal women are also responsible for pushing the whole trans and queer theory to the detriment of women and children. Just read a few more before getting back to it. Chapman coming in here. Safety over risk. Nothing safe about their attitude to illegal migration. Well, I suppose the argument might go here just that, well, where the sort of feminine, I suppose, whether Helen Andrews would say this or not, I don't know, but I suppose where the argument might go for someone who adheres to sort of great feminization theory is that the sort of tendency to be empathic would obviously result in prioritizing rights over responsibilities, which is kind of how you get into the immigration mess that Western countries by and large are in. We will get back to the comments in a moment, but just to continue on with Helen Andrews' article, um, she spoke about how the threat posed by wokeness can be large or small depending on the industry. She said it's sad that English departments are all feminized now. And I'll pause there for a second and just speak from my own experience to say that that is absolutely the case. I studied English literature at University College Dublin. It unfortunately was a very unpleasant experience. I can give an indication of this by saying in my third year, you had 90 modules to choose from. I honestly struggled to choose 5 that didn't have the words gender, sexuality, or race in their title, which, if you want to split hairs, some might say isn't a result of feminization. That's a result of, say, critical theory or something like that. And that's true, but some might also say that women might be more inclined to emphasize that than men. I don't know whether that would be the case. I mean, a lot of the most of the most famous critical theorists are men, so I don't know whether that would hold up. But anyway, uh, Helen Andrews said that it's sad that English departments are all feminized now, but most people's daily lives are unaffected by it. Other fields matter more. You might not be a journalist, but you live in a country where what gets written in the New York Times determines what is publicly accepted as the truth. If the Times becomes a place where in group consensus can suppress unpopular facts, more so than it already does, that affects every citizen. And I mean, for our purposes, swap in RTE determines what is publicly accepted as the truth, which, by the way, I saw reporting today on the case of a trans woman who something to do with her frozen sperm. So it's all so tiresome. Anyway, just to get to the crux of this article, the great feminization is truly unprecedented, she writes. Other civilizations have given women the vote, granted them property rights, or let them inherit the thrones of empires. No civilization in human history has ever experimented with letting women control so many vital institutions of our society, from political parties to universities to our largest businesses. Even where women do not hold the top spots, women set the tone in these organizations, such that a male CEO must operate within the limits set by his human resources VP. Um, it's understandable, obviously, here why this caused a stir in the US and why indeed this would cause a stir anywhere that's brought up. Because I do think that as societies we have undergone fairly seismic changes in the profile of the workforce in terms of the structure of families, all of these different things. And clearly that is going to have an effect on sort of corporate culture, on institutional culture. Whether or not it's entirely responsible for wokeness is obviously up for debate. I mean, when reading about this and the discourse around this, a lot of people were raising the fact that a lot of men bought into wokeness just as eagerly, say, as women did. A lot of people raised the fact that wokeness isn't so much an outworking of misguided femininity, say, as it was a religious movement nearly that was recognizing the problem of guilt in societies and attempting to extirpate that without having the sort of mechanisms that societies usually turn to in order to get rid of guilt, essentially. Looking at the comments here, whenever I sort of hiccup a little bit, that's what I'm doing. I think it goes crows. I hear. I think it goes beyond just demographics. It requires feminized men to support and make real change. What are your thoughts on the force doctrine theory? Well, crows. I don't have. I mean, I could Google it now, but I'm actually not familiar with the force doctrine theory. I can't say. That might show up my lack of education, but I'll live. You can send in a comment explaining it, and I might have an idea on it. Um, but anyway, this is the thesis that's been forwarded by Helen Andrews. She's made the case that women in have sort of the scale tipping, I suppose, in favor of women in the workplace has resulted in proper changes to the culture there. She says it's not that big a deal, say, as quoted a couple moments ago, it's not that big a deal when it's something like an English department, although try tell that to me a couple of years ago when I was studying English for 3 years. But it's a bigger deal then when it's an area like the law, or an area like I suppose journalism is an important one. So she says then in instances like that, you might have more sort of empathic responses to criminality or to wrongdoing, rather than a sort of justice oriented approach that sort of traditionally has reigned in patriarchal societies. It's not to say obviously the justice is done perfectly in patriarchal societies, but that's kind of the tilt. She says that this was sort of made possible by certain provisions in anti-discrimination legislation that kind of tipped the scales in women's favor, where it could become the case that a woman could take a lawsuit against a firm or something if they felt that she'd been sort of, overlooked, or if they felt like she hadn't been catered to in a workplace, which meant that management was naturally going to be more inclined to comply with, say, that particular kind of person, rather than push back against it because they might face some trouble. Um, as a result of that, she was essentially saying that she doesn't think that solving the feminization problem requires us to, the feminization problem, that's obviously her thesis, requires us to shut any doors in women's faces. We simply have to restore fair rules. Right now, we have a nominally meritocratic system in which it is illegal for women to lose. Let's make hiring meritocratic in substance and not just name, and we'll see how it shakes out. Make it legal to have a masculine office culture again. Remove the HR lady's veto power. I think people will be surprised to discover how much of our current feminization is attributable to institutional changes like the advent of HR, which were brought about by legal changes and which legal changes can reverse. Very interesting. I hope you agree. There's a really interesting discussion about this that I can never for the life of me remember how to pronounce this guy's name. Ross Douthat at the New York Times hosted, between the author of that article, Helen Andrews, and Leah Libresco Sargent, if I'm remembering her name correctly, in which Helen was obviously making her great feminization theory case. And this woman, Leah Libresco Sargent, who I would be a fan of, was essentially saying that no, this isn't a sort of result of women in the workplace. This is more so a result of sort of seeing workplaces as kind of being hostile. You know what? I'm not gonna try and sum up her case there because I might do it justice. It was quite complex. I would encourage people just to go and listen to it themselves. That's on, as I said, Ross Douthat's podcast, which is Interesting Times, I think it's called. But regardless of whether or not this theory is right or wrong, that it's popular, or that it's kind of felt, for want of a better way of putting it, I think is kind of undeniable. And this is where, as I mentioned at the top of the live stream, I want to turn to Nick Fuentes and that whole phenomenon, because while again he's an American streamer, both he and Helen Andrews are operating in the US. This stuff just washes over our social media unavoidably. I know young people in Ireland, say, who would watch Nick Fuentes and certainly follow him and things like this. And I think that he is as much a phenomena amongst young people in Ireland, certainly in the rest of the Anglosphere, as he is in the US. For people who don't know Nick Fuentes, he's a streamer in the US. He's been banned, deplatformed from pretty much everything that you can be banned and deplatformed from. And it has done absolutely, in the long run, to this point, it has done absolutely nothing to dent his popularity. If anything, because of it, he's more popular than ever. And this is where I want to bring in an Irish voice, Connor Fitzgerald, who some of you might be familiar with. Has an excellent Substack, and he writes really insightful articles. And he wrote one on this very topic, helpfully for me. Why is Nick Fuentes popular with young men? And again, as with Helen Andrews' article, I'm just looking at the comments again here before I get back to it. Um, Let me see here. Colin Riley chiming in here. Being female isn't necessarily a problem. I agree, Colin. But an army of woke identity politics, activist females most certainly are a problem. I mean, yes, but as you say, that could also be applied to, activist males who I see just as many of them out and about. Um, what else am I seeing here? Oh yeah, there's Crow's Eye back with presumably his force theory. To make any feminized change to society, it requires force that men have monopoly on to enforce it, e.g., police. I mean, there's certainly something to that. Um, Jody commenting here, women like woke men as people, but masculine men as mates. There's a conflict because woke women are compelled to reject those they are naturally attracted to. Yeah, I do think there's something to that. I do think that now I'm sort of speaking anecdotally here, but I'd say imagine woke men are they sort of went out in college and things like that. But there's a reason also that marriage rates are plummeting and things like that. Because I mean, if we think about this, if you're some guy who buys into the whole suite of beliefs, like marriage is patriarchal and it's outdated, you're obviously not going to want to get married. You're not going to want to get tied down with uh, kids, although you probably frame it as you don't want to burden a woman with kids in your sort of woke way. Long story short, that isn't conducive to finding a partner and settling down. So, I mean, this is a whole other topic about how sort of conservative values and indeed, uh, as you can see behind me, I would say religious values are conducive to longevity in terms of actually having families and raising kids and things like that. So, I think that yeah, there's something to that anyway. But back to Connor Fitzgerald's article, which I really would recommend people go read if they're interested in these. And as I said, I'm going to quote from this as I quoted from Helen Andrews' article. So I sort of outlined, Nick Fuentes. I didn't finish giving my full outline of Nick Fuentes because I should add, obviously, I just said he was deplatformed, didn't explain why. He's been deplatformed because he's enormously controversial. As I said at the top, I'm not a fan of Nick Fuentes. I think uh, he's says deplorable things. He is, it seems to my eyes, pretty clearly immature, and he's kind of working that out on a massive stage. All of that said, I understand why he's popular, and indeed, so does I think Connor Fitzgerald, and I'll let sort of Connor's article speak for itself here before I get into my thoughts towards the end of the thing. So, quoting from the article here, Fuentes has said things on any cultural subject you can name, but especially Jewish people and the Holocaust, that are miles outside the normal range of respectable political discourse, but is nevertheless very popular both in general terms and amongst young men in particular. He's therefore the living incarnation of young men's alienation from that political mainstream, and his popularity is worth understanding. Another quote here. He was speaking, just to preface it, he was speaking about how there's a big debate going on, and this is part of the reason I wanted to discuss this stuff this evening, because I think this debate is taking place in the US at the moment, but it has some relevance to the right, loosely phrased, in Ireland and elsewhere. Uh, this debate about platforming Nick Fuentes, and he was speaking about how all of that debate has resulted in a lot of coverage of Nick Fuentes in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, all of these major publications. And Connor Fitzgerald writes, the coverage isn't terribly enlightening. It is centered around the concept of platforming without answering the question of why would young men be drawn to someone who says extreme things about Jews, immigrants, black people, women. As with Trump, there is a sense that regardless of Fuentes' specific views, An attitude of calculated nastiness is one part of his appeal, but there's reluctance to think more deeply about that question for fear of appearing to endorse or excuse something he said. The answer is complicated but seems obvious enough to me, so I guess I'll do it. Um, and what he gets into then is about, well, I'll read this next quote. I won't put words in his mouth. This skips on a little bit. But since the dawn of social media, our society has faced a particular challenge, which is that the etiquette one is expected to observe to be considered a decent and upstanding person, and the views that are enforced through social pressure drive hard in a specific partisan direction, specifically a progressive one. These standards prioritize one particular outlook, which in its most malign incarnation is based on valorizing pity, marginality, inadequacy. It's a moral framework that appeals to a certain type of person who is much more likely to be a woman than a man. So that's the end of the quote. I think you kind of have here where the sort of overlap lies with the great feminization theory, which is that institutions, uh, politics, law, corporate culture, all of these things have moved in a direction that more so suits women than it does men. And as a result, men are feeling sort of alienated. Because of that, they're obviously much more likely to tune into someone like Fuentes, who sort of throws caution to the wind and says whatever he wants to say. I'm just going to have a look at the comments here. Um, Fuentes' remarks on Stalin and Hitler are so juvenile. Yeah, I do agree with that. Um, I'm just skipping on. What's this here? Oh, people responding to each other in the chat. I'm not necessarily going to interrupt their debates. Um, so yeah, just to follow on with Connor Fitzgerald's article here. He was speaking about, yeah, this issue that platforming is essentially the wrong frame to be having the whole Fuentes discussion in, because, as I said at the top, he's been deplatformed as much as he can possibly be deplatformed, and it's only contributed to his popularity. And I think that is the key. It's contributed to his popularity because you have this society now that has attempted to sort of make probing boundaries, which I would say men are primed to do. I certainly did it. I don't think I'm unusual in that. I've observed that in my friends and in other men. I think there is something inherent in masculinity that likes to sort of push boundaries, that does like to be disagreeable and sometimes performatively so. Like, I no problem saying I was sometimes a little bitch in school, in terms of just sort of arguing for the sake of arguing, or sort of rubbing people the wrong way for the sake of rubbing people the wrong way. And I do think, not to toot my own horn here, that's sort of a male trait. I don't think I'm unique in having that. So he's sort of honing in on this problem here, that, yeah, sort of platforming is the wrong way to sort of discuss this, because it's not really the frame that this whole conversation takes place in. Platforming doesn't necessarily matter to someone like, say, Nick Fuentes or his fans. He said towards the end of the article that what's kind of going on is that they're retreating to or creating places that are, say, so awful that no one wants to, or the perception anyway, they're retreating to and creating places that are so awful that no one wants to make them decent, or which carry indecency in their DNA. For new and emerging male inclined spaces, offensiveness against progressive values is, in purely evolutionary terms, selected for. In 2025, being offensive or mean or nasty or cruel, or even just not caring if someone thinks you're any of those things, is a defensive posture because of how public and private conduct is policed. I wasn't quoting in order here. I was just taking snippets here, but I will just quote the end of his article where he said, in other words, we're now in a post gatekeeping era. Where we go from here, we'll have to take account of that. I say this as a statement of fact rather than a celebration. It's Nick's world now. I do think that Nick Fuentes is a reaction against the perceived feminization of society. As I say, that isn't to weigh in on the correctness of that theory. I think I think sort of the discourse itself has played a large role in creating these dynamics. And I do think that sort of the move towards policing what can and can't be said, towards making sure that nothing is ever offensive, was always going to provoke a counter reaction an offensive counter reaction, one that was sort of gratuitously offensive. And there was always going to come a point at which the dam would sort of break and people would just stop caring whether you were calling them, say, racist or sexist or this or that ist, because these words, I mean, this isn't insightful stuff. 15 years ago, people were saying that, if you call everyone a Nazi, if you call everyone a racist, at some point people are going to stop listening to you because you've been saying it for so long that these words have lost all meaning. And we're finally getting to a place where the people at the kind of vanguard of this, which are young men, because they're the ones to whom these phrases have been applied for so long. The ability to sort of police, though, that has just collapsed altogether. This was totally foreseeable. I don't think it's a healthy dynamic. I obviously don't think that people should be aiming to be sort of, yeah, as I say, performatively offensive. But you have to understand why this is happening and where it came from. Um, I'm just skipping through comments here. There's the trouble with running the live stream. There's a lot of conversations taking place that you're not necessarily able to keep up to date with entirely. There was another really interesting thread from the perspective of a parent. I don't know where Connor Fitzgerald comes at these things from, but there was coming from the perspective of a parent. It was a thread that went viral on X in relation to, yeah, again, why young men follow Nick Fuentes. And he was essentially speaking about how absurd the world must appear through the eyes of the average 11-year-old. I think his son is 11, this guy who was posting. It went so viral, he turned it into a Substack again, which seems to be what everyone does these days. And he was making the case that he went into a parent teacher meeting, or he went into some sort of engagement that his son had in school, and the again, assuming everyone just knows what I mean here, the wokeness was performative. There's sort of rainbows everywhere, an insane premium put on LGBTQ messaging and signaling, despite that obviously remaining a very small segment of the population. Um, this was in America, so obviously lots of Black Lives Matter. Well, don't necessarily need to press that within America. We saw plenty of Black Lives Matter in Ireland for who knows what reason back in its heyday. And he was essentially making the point that I will pull out one paragraph here. Uh, the point of his article then is to get you to understand why young men will attach themselves to any voice who is willing to stridently call for the obliteration of the social system and ideology which lied to them during their formative years and is currently doing things which rob them of their opportunities for advancement and success. The institutions have totally blown their credibility with young men and have completely destroyed young men's trust in institutions. Young men view the current set of social institutions as ideologically corrupt and totally illegitimate, and they view the narratives that emerge from those institutions as being expressions of nothing more than a story told to legitimize an ideology which seeks to hold them back. It's a bit wordy, but I guess people will get what I mean. And again, this kind of goes beyond the whole gendered thing, but I do think that generally speaking, it does fit into this in some sense, because wokeness is obviously very much tied. It's a subversive thing. It's very much tied to critical theory, and according to critical theory, which orders the world according to sort of hierarchies of victimhood and hierarchies of oppression, which again, white men and young white men find themselves at the receiving end of, or have constantly over the past decade and a half. There's only so long men were going to put up with that. As I say, I don't think the way in which the dam is breaking, this is my opinion here, is good or healthy. As I say, I don't think being gratuitously offensive or offensive for the sake of being offensive is good. As I said, I think, like, yeah, Nick Fuentes, the man of the moment. I think he says a lot of absolutely abhorrent things, but you can acknowledge that while also acknowledging why he has become popular, which means that, like, okay, acknowledging that this is the moment that we're in, where do we go from here? Because we just took a bit of a whistle stop tour through some of the things that are being written about it. And I think that a lot of the issue at the moment is that both sides are engaging in kind of grievance politics, for want of a better way of putting it. On the one side, you have the kind of, to tie a couple of loose things together, you have the kind of, yeah, say feminists or people who believe in woke ideology who will say that, yeah, women have been sort of victims of oppressive men constantly, which is obviously women at times in places have been victims of oppressive men, but it's a gross exaggeration to say that that's always the case in terms of categories that women are just victims of men. So you have that extreme on the one hand, then you have the extreme on the other hand, which is obviously men taking issue now with sort of women more generally and sort of what they perceive as a feminized society and reacting out sort of bluntly against that in the sort of opposite or antagonistic way to wokeness. I think obviously a much more, we're not going to solve this tonight to the surprise of no one, but it'll come as no surprise. I'm a Catholic. I think men and women are complementary. I think if something has gone wrong with the way men sort of view the world or young men view the world, that means something has probably gone wrong with the way young women view the world. I think if something has gone wrong with the way young women view the world, vice versa, something has probably gone wrong with the way young men view the world. Um, I wrote an article a couple of months back at this stage, over a year ago. Where does the time go? In which I quoted an article from The Atlantic from February 1939. I should have just read the quote and asked if you could guess as to when it comes from because it's interesting. By psychiatrist Karl A. Menninger, and the state of affairs that he outlined, it sounded like shockingly familiar. I'm going to quote it here. We're left at a rather hopeless impasse. The social and economic structure deprives women of children and antagonizes them toward children. The children reflect this in their subsequent associations with other adults and with the next generation. Men turn from women to the company of other men and thus thwart women further, and they in turn inflict more aggressions upon men and upon children. That was written in 1939, and it seems to me that is just as applicable today. The reason I quote that is to say that this is clearly not a new dynamic or a new problem. I do think that there's a tendency for antagonization between the sexes. I mean, Jordan Peterson did this really well, going into the biblical stories in a way that everyone could appreciate. And I think that there is some value in doing so. I mean, I think you see this dynamic in the age old story, obviously, of Adam and Eve, which is that, Eve eats the fruit, encourages Adam to do the same. When God comes and asks, well, why'd you do that? They immediately turn on each other, and God's like, well, the woman did it. She gave the apple. She gave the apple to me, and you gave the woman to me, essentially. So this sort of tendency to antagonize the opposite sex, I think, has probably been with us for a very long time. What the solution to it is, I mean, there's no easy answer. To go back to that old article by Menninger, uh, he got a bit cliche about it, but I don't think that necessarily means he was wrong. He said, fortunately, there's a powerful force operating towards the mitigating or counteracting of this self destructiveness. There is that tremendous power which draws men and women together, and which draws men and women together, and which draws us all. I must have copied that wrong, the quote wrong, which draws men and women together, and which draws us all together in varying degrees of intensity and effectiveness. It may seem a little trite to come around finally to the conclusion, as Freud has done, that to combat our self destructiveness, we must love one another. Oh, how lovely. But I think he's right all the same. I think, didn't get into live streams to do lectures, but I do think the sort of modern understanding of the word love is entirely lacking. And in a more sort of classically grounded understanding of that concept, it probably does have a lot to say to the situation that we find ourselves in. I feel like when the family, as we discussed on the last live stream, sort of came under attack, obviously the sort of connection between family and society was severed in a sense, and that was very much to our sort of imaginative detriment, to our uh, the detriment of our ability to visualize solutions. Because I feel like a solution to sort of our societal problem is the loving marriage. Being a young married man, I mean, I'm not really in a position to offer that much marriage advice, only having been married for 4 years. But I see the way my wife is a woman and I'm a man, and that's very, very different. And that causes no end of conflict and tension. But nevertheless, you're bound by love, and that forces you to sort of work together and get over that, and to sort of, yeah, bank on the complementarity of your uh oh, I'm just looking at the comments here coming in. Jay, this comment came in last week as well, so I can't say it comes in every week. Jason, should I take the black pill if I'm an unlovable chud? Bro, you're not. I'll put the comment up on screen. Everyone give Himalayas 1887 some love. Jason, should I take the black pill if I'm an unlovable chud? You're not an unlovable chud. Himalayas 1887. You are loved by God, and there's absolutely no reason to black pill. Um, there's a lot of there's as much opportunity to do good and to live an adventurous life now as ever there was. So that's that. But the point I was just going to conclude on, because we've been going for 50 minutes here and people are presumably bored of me at this stage, is that yeah, I do think that we sort of marginalized marriage to our detriment and the lessons that it has for us, because you sort of see in the way in which men and women are bound together and that and can work out their differences a model for society. Um, well, unfortunately, as I say, we got rid of the wisdom that a strong family is good for a strong nation. We sort of come to this place of the rainbow family where, everything is good for society, everything is good for the nation, and it's kind of like that's not necessarily the case, guys. So I do think that not that I'm going to solve this tonight, but yeah, sort of observing successful marriages and seeing sort of how masculinity and femininity interact in that setting successfully with all of the sort of tension that exists in every marriage is somewhere to go to start looking at a solution to, okay, how can you apply this to the social conversation, to the cultural conversation? How might that sort of diffuse yeah, grievance wokeness? How might this diffuse a sort of grievance reaction to wokeness? But yeah, that's kind of enough for this evening. I'll have a look just at the last comments, which I feel like someone intruding on a conversation half the time here. I think the Polish are heavily into remembering the dead, presumably talking to someone else, because while that's true, I don't know what the relevance is. But yeah, thank you all for joining this week. I think that yeah, we're going to keep these going. If you have thoughts on this, if you have feedback, absolutely feel free to get in touch with Jason at grip.ie. I got a bunch of emails after the last one, and I do take those on board, and I will plan on getting back to as many people as I can. And we will, yeah, keep it up. And we're still figuring out the format exactly. I mean, we'll also be discussing more current affairs and reacting to different things. But for the moment, um, this is kind of the way we're doing it, and I hope that people enjoy it. So, without further ado, we'll leave it there for the evening. God bless, and we'll talk to you next Wednesday.